Hello friends, for today's video I wanted to do a reading wrap up for some things that I have picked up as of late that I haven't really had a chance to talk to as in depth, and I do have new releases wrap ups fairly frequently. Recently it's been about every 3 weeks or so, but I don't really have a set thing in place for talking about everything else I pick up, whether it be backlist or whether it be things from other genres, until I do end of the quarter best of. And I thought I would like to remedy that and actually be able to talk about some of the things I've been picking up outside of new releases. So let me know, do you want me to do maybe every 3 books that I read similar to what I do for new fantasy releases wrap-ups, or are you okay with there just being the occasional wrap-up and I just talk about whatever I've picked up that isn't a new release? Let me know if you have any feedback on that. But I am going to ensure that the steampunk books that I've been picking up over the course of this year that I am going to be talking about in depth in a steampunk video, those I'm not going to be talking about. And then there are some other things I've read this year that I won't be talking about today because I've done maybe an in-depth review for them or something. For example, the first book in the Gale Song series, which is fantastic and I highly recommend. I did do an in-depth review for that one. So I'm going to be talking about books today that I haven't really had a chance to go as in-depth with. One other thing to note though before we jump into it, I'm also not going to be getting into the manga that I've read, just because I have a whole side channel dedicated to anime and manga, video games, all the other kinds of stories that so many of us love. So if you are interested though, the 2 things that I have been reading recently, I did get all caught up on the Frieren where it leaves off after the show. I picked up the manga there and got caught up with that, and I do have videos that coordinate with Frieren. So if you're a fan of that or if you've ever been interested in it, I'll have my Frieren playlist linked. And then I just checked out Demons of the Shadow Realm. If you know nothing about this is by the same creator as Full Metal Alchemist, which that probably at the very least rings some bells for a lot of you. I love Full Metal Alchemist so much. Is it the thing that I talk about too often next to Final Fantasy X? Because those 2 things aren't books, but they come up a lot on this channel. But anyway, I recently did a rewatch of Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and I did discussions with my friend Gavin from Gavin Reads It All, and Gavin reads all the manga. He also has multiple channels, but we did in-depth discussions for the entire story. It was his first time watching it, and that was an absolute blast. So if you are feeling nostalgic, or if you love Full Metal and you want to geek out over those, Gavin is delightful. It was so great. The discussions I thought were just so fantastic, mostly because he's a fantastic person to have conversations with, but also because Full Metal's so good, so I never get tired of talking about it. But the point is that Demons of the Shadow Realm is by the same creator, Arakawa, and I recently did a first impressions for these first 3 volumes. It is spoiler free, and I am planning to continue on with this series. So if you're interested in seeing thoughts on those, I'll have those videos linked. I also am going to start doing movie reviews. So I've recently done one for Princess Mononoke, Sinners, and Pan's Labyrinth. And then just in general, I talk about, video games and other such things like Expedition 33, because it's fantastic. I've done a number of videos for that. But for this video, we are just going to be sticking to some books that I have picked up as of late. I'll start with the one that I was really excited for, and then it hasn't worked out for me, and I am going to continue on, and I am going to finish the series. And I'm doing it not because I'm loving the series, but because I enjoy the people that are in the buddy read alongside me, and that would be Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. So I did do a video. It was less about the series, and it was more about Simon. So I don't like the protagonist of the series, and I do want to pose a question to all of you, because that video, I think this is kind of funny. That's the biggest subscriber drop I've had in a long time. I don't really pay attention to my analytics. I actively do not push the analytics button. It's not an actual button. It's like, how smartphones work. They don't really have buttons. You just select. I actively do not look at my analytics because for me, I always want to ensure that the content that I'm putting out is what I want to talk about, that I'm passionate about, and that I'm interested in. And I do feel like you can very easily get sucked into the analytics side of things, and then you can start looking at, well, what performed well? Maybe I should try to do more like that. And that's not really what I like to do. It's not how I like to go about my channel. When I converted from doing this as a hobby to doing this as a job, that was something I told myself I really need to ensure that I don't have affect me too much, the analytics, because I want to maintain that feeling of this is a passion of mine and not think about it purely from the it's my job angle. I don't know why I did air quotes. It is my job. But the point is, when you open the YouTube app, which is where I will go to change thumbnails or update the description bars or things like that, when you go to the app, it just shows you at the top your subscriber count. And every time I would go to the app, I was just like, oh, wow, I'm sorry. I upset some people. I'm not sorry for being honest with my thoughts, but I also recognize that sometimes we have things that we really, really love and we adore, and it can be really aggravating when somebody is trashing on that thing. And I wasn't trashing on all of the Dragonbone chair. I was just trashing on Simon. It was a big heaping of trashing onto that character. I really despise him. I can't stand him as a protagonist. So that is known. The question, though, that I wanted to ask is, what is a book or character that if somebody trashes, you're like, I'm out? I actually want to know, because as much as people say, I love hearing disagreeing thoughts, I love hearing other sides of the aisle, I want to know what people who dislike this book I love think. As much as people say that, sometimes there are books, or sometimes there are characters, or there are certain things that are so meaningful to us that you really deep down, you will hear no slander. For me, I'll answer the question too, but I really want to know all of your answers. I really want to know your answers for this. For me, I don't want to hear any slander about Final Fantasy X. I don't want to hear any about Full Metal Alchemist. I don't want to hear it. I think they're great. However, for myself, if I can see that somebody's going to talk poorly about those things, I'm probably just not going to click, because I'm like, I know that I'm a little sensitive with these things. So I think it's best I just avoid it entirely. They can have their opinions, that's fine. And I just avoid seeing thoughts in that area. But I do think I think sometimes we need to be really honest with ourselves, that we just genuinely, we don't want to see it sometimes. Sometimes we don't want to hear the disagreeing opinion. But anyway, let's talk about the Dragonbone chair and the Stone of Farewell. Because I did talk a little bit about the Dragonbone chair in that video where I talked about Simon, I am going to more so focus on the second book, or at the very least I'm going to kind of couple them together. The Dragonbone chair is the first in what is sometimes referred to as a 4-book trilogy, because the third book's so long, it was split into 2. But for just to keep things consistent, I'll just say it's a trilogy. We start the story with this young boy named Simon, who is basically a kitchen boy. He was orphaned at a young age and raised by people who work at this castle, where there is a king who is very respected among his people, who did a lot to ensure security for the realm. And this king is basically on his deathbed. One really big concern for a lot of people across this country is that this is going to result in this legacy going and this likely decline, this golden age of their country. It is likely going to lead to somewhat of a decline, because he was just one in a million kinds of rulers. He has 2 sons, and it is likely that the one son named Elias is going to rule, and then the other son named Joshua is likely just going to assist him in some fashion, or that he's just going to go about his life in a different area. But Joshua certainly is not interested in trying to have the throne from Elias. He doesn't really have a choice in getting involved, though, when Elias, it would seem, is not who he always was in the past. In fact, it seems like he is very much being manipulated, at the very least, by this particular priest, who very much has a voice in his ear. It seems like he has a lot of control over what is transpiring, and he doesn't seem like he wants what's best for all of the people of this land. And here's Simon, just a kitchen boy who really wants nothing to do with anything. He just kind of wants to have a life filled with meaning and glory. He wants to go on adventures. He's just kind of annoyed with his day-to-day life, and he wishes that he could have something more exciting happen. And a lot of the story is exploring that when you do have the more exciting things happen, they are not at all what you anticipated. The journey is not this romantic epic like you maybe thought it would be, and it's actually really harrowing. It's really terrible. You witness so much atrocity. We're reflecting as we go through the course of the story on how much we should really honestly value our general basic lives. That's a lot of his development over the course of these first 2 books, and I do appreciate that reflection. I still don't really feel like as a character that Simon is, 1, compelling, 2, I don't really feel like he matures in a way that I find to be on the same level as the character development that we get in certain other stories. I do recognize that this isn't necessarily, or at least in my opinion, it's not necessarily a close character examination in the same way something like Stormlight Archive is, to draw a comparison to another epic fantasy story. I recognize that it is a little bit more about the lore and the thematic elements being pulled from this vast epic land. The lore is very deep. It does not necessarily feel like we're going across all these different countries the way that some epic fantasy is. It's more, I think of it kind of vertical versus horizontal, in the sense that if we're thinking of epic fantasy in terms of geography, where you're kind of spreading out over the course of different cultures, different lands, different peoples, if you're doing it that, it feels like this, whereas this one almost feels vertical in a sense, like we're sinking back into the past and we're reflecting on that. We're seeing the ways that modern day, the victor gets to write the story, and how when you actually reflect back, maybe that's not everything that you were told, and that especially proves true for the antagonistic force that comes into play throughout the story, which you're kind of discovering as you read through it. The one thing that I actually do quite like about these first two books is the writing. I think the writing is leaning a little bit towards formal, which I don't mind at all, and I do think that I miss that a little bit. I don't mind somewhere in between, where it feels slightly more conversational a little bit here and there, or a little bit more straightforward. I think sometimes that actually works really well for epic fantasy because there's so much else to take in. So the less that you can have a barrier of entry, the better in some ways. But at the same time, I think sometimes we're kind of eroding the artistry that is writing and the utilization of language in our stories. And in that sense, I really miss this kind of writing. So that is the one thing that consistently I will praise this series for. However, plot progression wise, it can be very repetitive, and there's a lot of very little happening for a very long time, and then something explosive happening, and then a lot of nothing, or a lot of the same thing happening for a really long time, and then something explosive. And these books are very, very, very long. So in the second book, this was proving especially true for me. Most of the characters in some fashion are on the run. So the character Joshua, for example, is on the run with a small party. The character Simon is on the run with a small party. He's just on the run in a cold climate. And then you also have repetition of certain plot points, or I should say similar plot points. So for example, there's this whole kind of interrogation trial arc that happens early on in the second book, and it involves somebody not really marrying another person. And then later in the book, you have a different character have a plot line that involves not marrying a certain individual. And they're not interacting with the same groups of people. It's not the same culture. So to have two plot lines that were kind of similar in that sense, those were examples of, oh, now something explosive is happening. But that wasn't particularly climactic or edge of my seat, for me anyway, because I'm like, well, we kind of just did this. And another aspect of the story is I don't really feel stakes or tension. Maybe it's because it kind of has that classic good versus evil feel, which you can have stakes within, I just want to be clear. But within that, I do think there is this sense of you feel like your heroes are relatively safe, and as a result, I found that oftentimes when something more intense was happening, instead of being like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? I was like, can we just finish this part? Because I know how it's going to go. It's like when you have an action scene and you don't buy into the stakes of the action scene because you know your good guys are going to win. So you just kind of wait for the action to finish up. You not only know they're going to win, but they're probably going to come out of it relatively unscathed also. And that's kind of how I feel about a lot of the events, where I'm like, I know that I know they're going to get through this. So can we just get to the part where they're through it? And I do find that there are other writers that are very gifted at, even when you're pretty sure everybody's going to be fine, you can still buy into it, you can still be edge of your seat and really invested based off of the way it's written, or based off of other aspects of what's transpiring around the scene. And in this, it's kind of like meander, and then event pop up, and I'm pretty sure everybody's going to make through. So it just kind of feels like a thing to have happen to break up the monotony, which for me doesn't really make for the most compelling of tales. However, I can buy into that if I really love the characters and the character work, but because I don't in this story, then I don't have that really as well. And then on top of all of that, it's not just that I don't necessarily love these characters, it's that I actively dislike a lot of them. So we already know, because I did a whole video, I don't love Simon. I don't love Simon. I will say I've gone from active frustration to now I just kind of laugh at him. Philip. That doesn't mean I'm coming around to him. Philip Chase. We were having a discussion about this and he's like, well, maybe. And I'm like, no. So I have him linked, as well as Aaron, who's been hosting the discussions for these. So I'll have Aaron's channel linked, and everybody who's participating in the live shows for those, I'll have all their channels linked. And they all feel mostly more favorable than I do about the story, so it makes for a fun discussion. Anyway, I'm at a state where I'm just kind of like, oh my gosh, about everything that Simon does. So for example, there's a part where Simon, not for the first time, so once again feeds into the repetition thing, is lost in the forest. It's not really funny, it's just funny to me because of what I'm about to say. He's lost in the forest for not the first time. When he got lost in the forest the first time, which, hey, I would get lost too, just to be clear, but when he's lost again in the forest, he recalls that after being lost in the forest the first time, this character that is very kind to him and looks after him, this character taught him, here's what you can do if you get lost in the forest to try and get out of the forest. And now that he's lost again, he thinks, I know he taught me how to get out of the forest, but there was this three-legged lizard when he was talking, and I was just watching that three-legged lizard, so I don't really remember what he said, but also, he should have made his lesson more interesting, and then maybe I would have paid attention. And this is in the second book, really far into the second book, and he had that same thought in the first book. He would blame people that were trying to teach him, and to be clear, about things he was interested in. They would be explaining battles to him, or the history of the world to him, and these were things he claimed he wanted to know about. And he would be listening to them, and then he'd get bored because he'd be like, oh, all these names. And then he would get frustrated, like, why can't they spice it up? Why can't they make this more interesting? And the fact that he did this again, and he blames, it's just so funny to me. He had a number of things that made me laugh. Another was that he, at least 3 times, and a little bit, I kind of get this one, at least 3 different times, his response to a situation is that he wishes that he could lay down and not know anything. And that's pretty funny. I did appreciate that. But I'm not a Simon fan. And I also am not really a fan of Joshua. I wish I liked Joshua more, especially because in the second book, you definitely have way more of the other characters, which I appreciated. Until I realized, oh, I don't really like any of them either. And then I didn't really... I thought it would be a plus, and it wasn't necessarily. Part of what makes Joshua annoying for me isn't that I like or I do dislike this character. It's that I don't really feel like Joshua has a distinct enough personality. He's kind of just fulfilling a kind of a trope or a character archetype. And that's fine, but then this woman that he's with is insufferable. Shiva is her name, and it's a really cool name. And she is so unbearably hysterical at all times. Their dynamics are so uncomfortable and strange. I do not like their interactions. I find her so annoying. I was talking to my friend Patrick, and Patrick's like, oh, get ready. And I was like, how, why is this character so frustrating? So I don't really like Shiva, and she is there with Joshua, unfortunately. I do feel like the antagonists in some ways are kind of generically evil. I can get on board with that sometimes, but in this story, I just don't know that I find them fun or exciting or vehicles for thematic elements quite in the same way that I do in other stories, so I'm not really gripped by the antagonist. In fact, the kind of antagonistic force as you go through the story, I don't want to say too much here because I don't want to get into spoilers, but it has to do with things that happened in the past, so it ties back to the thematic elements in that sense. So things that happened in the past, and the ways that the people that Simon is a part of, his people, what they've done in the past, and how that led to a lot of festering hatred, and understandable festering hatred. But then that, in a sense, becomes kind of the antagonistic force for all. And it's not that I have a problem with that, because talking about Full Metal Alchemist, I feel like Scar is one of the best examples of how that can be shown. And with this, we're just not really sinking our teeth into this concept as much as I would prefer. An example of sometimes the level of depth that we get with our antagonists, or at the very least how they are shown to us to be antagonistic, is something that I touched on within the video about Simon. And that has to do with the character Pyretes, who is this priest character, the one that kind of is whispering in Elias's ear. And early on, Simon is looking over at him, and he essentially stomps a dog to death. And right away, you're like, oh, he's bad. And he looks bad as well, the way he's described. He's described in a way that is, I don't want to go as far as to say cartoonishly villainous, but it's not necessarily something where you question. Every antagonist is kind of right from the start. By the way, this is a bad guy. Here you go. I'm giving that information to you very clearly. And sometimes that works. In fact, I am going to discuss a trilogy that I reread recently, and I'll talk about the ways it worked there and why it worked there, and in this one it's not working as much for me. I think the thematic elements that the series is touching on are ones that I really, really like, especially the concept of how our history and our lore is determined by whoever conquered whoever else. I think that that's a great thing to explore. I just don't find that we're exploring it as much as I would like, or with as much depth as I would like. We're getting a lot of the lore, a lot of the information, but I wouldn't mind if maybe these themes were shown to us in a way that had a little bit more subtlety, or sometimes we actually got a little bit more of the perspectives of the peoples who have been misrepresented by the way that history has been shown to us. The last thing I want to note is the use of very, very frequent switching between characters and page breaks. So for books that are this long, I don't mind whatsoever having a large cast of characters. I don't mind switching between the characters, and I don't mind page breaks. None of that bothers me. It's just that it happens pretty excessively in this, which results in this sort of snapshot feeling, like you're never really sitting with the characters, which is kind of staggering considering how large the book is. You would think we would kind of sit with characters for a while and then we go and see what so-and-so over here is doing. And I had a part where I have a few tabs where it goes from beginning to end of a section where every single page, there's a page break. Some of these page breaks are an indication of there being kind of a break in the day for certain characters, and then sometimes it's just truly switching between perspectives. So on this page, there's a page break here, and you flip the page and there's a page break here, and you flip the page and there's a page break up here, and you flip the page and there's a more formal page break here because there's a little design, and then you flip the page and there's a page break here, and you get the point. But it's that really often, and it's not that that can't work, it's just not really working for me in this story. As a result, it makes me feel a little bit more detached from the characters than I would prefer. So there's a lot of things in this story that are just not quite working for me. Pacing, characterization. I like the themes, I just don't know that I love how they're shown and executed. I like the writing, but a lot of the things that aren't working for me outweigh my like of the writing. I am continuing on with the series for the sake of the read-along, so I will happily say if suddenly the end completely shifts my perspective. I don't know that it's going to. I would have DNF'd this if not for the read-along, to be honest. So it's not that I'm continuing on just to dogpile. I am usually one that if something's not working for me, I don't want to keep reiterating the same points over and over again as to, see, I don't like it still. That's not typically what I like to do, but I will finish this up for the sake of the read-along, the sake of the discussions, which I've been enjoying. I mentioned a moment before that there are instances where antagonists can be sometimes cartoonishly evil, and sometimes it can work for me. It just depends on how it's done. And I think that's very true of the Shadow of the Fox trilogy. So this was a reread for me. I had a blast rereading this. This was a buddy read for my patrons, so we did do an in-depth discussion for both the first book and then the trilogy as a whole. If you're interested in seeing that, I'll have it linked. This was so much fun, and it was also more fun upon reread because you actually get to appreciate how much Kagawa put into the story that you have no chance really of realizing. You don't really have the foreshadowing done in a way where, oh yeah, you could figure it out. It's more of like you see it in hindsight. So when you get to the end, you're like, that's what that has been this whole time. And then when you reread it, then you feel more clued into it and you're like, oh wow. And it just shows you the depth to which the foreshadowing was done, but how oblivious you are to it and how in the dark you are to it. And it makes for a great reread experience. And it makes for some fun reveals towards the end. In the antagonistic sense, The way that this story is set up is you have a lot of Japanese folklore incorporated into this, and specifically with the oni. And the way that the oni are done, one, it's so fun because if you look up, whenever they're describing a certain kind of oni and you look it up and you try to find artwork for these things, it just it invites you to further explore a lot of the lore that is being presented in this. But also the oni are just demons. They're just like, oh, I want to conquer, basically, and I want to try and rip you apart, and I seek blood. And they have kind of cheesy dialogue sometimes. And I do want to make known, if you don't know, this is a young adult series. So there's also the sense that this is technically meant for a young demographic. Of course, as always, I always like to clarify, just because something has a certain target demographic doesn't mean it can't be enjoyed by other people of other ages. But it is a young adult series. So I do think that that's something to consider as well. But regardless, I mean, they're demons, right? They're not necessarily being represented in the same way as humans. It's not one of these things where it's like, what if we just need to extend a hand and show them kindness? It really does kind of have this good versus evil, and the people of this land against the demons. And the setup for the story, if you don't know, is you follow this young girl who is half kitsune, and she has been tasked with trying to deliver this piece of this very important scroll to a certain place, and she crosses paths with Tatsumi, who is somebody who works for a shadow clan who is seeking out the pieces of this scroll. And she tricks him into thinking that she knows where the scroll is, not that she actually possesses a piece of it. And she does this because she needs somebody to protect her as she goes from point A to point B. And she realizes, I either can have him protect me by tricking him, or I can tell him I have the scroll, in which case he will take it from me, and I can't let him do that. So she kind of tricks him. He accompanies her on this journey, and as they do, we also see this nobleman that joins them, and we also have a ronin who accompanies them as well. And then you're kind of exploring both her background and her family history as you progress through the story. And then with Tatsumi, you really start to zero in on why he is the way he is, and why he's been so forced into this place of basically being emotionless, this state of having no feeling. And it's in large part due to the fact that he wields a sword that has a demon within it. And if he allows himself to open up too much, that also is an opportunity for the demon to take over. So he does everything he can to shut off all of his emotions. But you're also exploring what that process was like to get him to that point so that he could wield this sword. And the series is an absolute blast. It's so much fun. As I stated, the lore especially, and getting to look into these monsters, these oni, is a great time. I like the character development over the course of the series, and I do feel like this ties back to a different time in the young adult age range, because I do find that young adult has, of course, its trends, its shifts, and as much as people point to young adult books as being really trendy, I actually think, in a sense, because it kind of goes through trends fast, it actually shifts a lot, which makes it very easy within, 2 or 3 years to be like, oh, I miss young adult 2 or 3 years ago. But that said, I think adult fantasy actually lingers in certain spaces for longer. And that's why, for so long, everything felt very Tolkien-esque. And then we kind of had a shift. And I think we're currently right now coming out of the everything has to have the rules and limitations kind of magic systems. I think we're kind of coming out of that. We're also seeing this divide where fantasy and fantasy romance are officially splitting. So then it's like, what's in store for fantasy next? And now that fantasy romance is a new thing, what's it gonna do? And so we're kind of at an interesting turning point. But the point is, I do think that this goes back to a time in young adult fantasy that just felt so adventurous and so fun, and like you were truly going on a quest. And it is very quest-oriented as well. And it's kind of episodic feeling. I so badly would love an anime adaptation of this. I think it'd be a great time. If you are somebody that has a child, or if you are somebody that is an aunt or an uncle and you like to read with your nieces or nephews or anything like that, I think this would be such a fun one to buddy read. I think it would be a blast. It's just fun. It's a fun series. I'm glad I reread it. I enjoyed it more on reread. Has great rereadability in general, and it was a very good time. Next up, we have Lady Tan's Circle of Women. This is a historical fiction story, but it is rooted in real events, and specifically a real woman that existed. And her story is devastating. It is harrowing, and she is a very inspirational individual, especially given her circumstances. And I actually did a video that was somewhat of a companion video to the Simon video I did, and it was specifically highlighting how to have flawed characters in a way where you feel really inspired by them, but you also recognize that by today's standards, they have certain views you don't agree with, or they live by or abide by certain things that you don't align with. However, a lot of what it comes down to is how the setting is executed. And I absolutely feel like historical fiction, if you are going to have a story rooted in a different time period, it is essentially vital that you capture the setting really well. Otherwise, the way that the characters are portrayed can come across a little surface level, or it can seem like the setting is just an aesthetic as opposed to actually trying to transport us to this time so that we can understand these characters and why they behave the way that they do. I thought that the way this one was done was exceptional. I think this book is fantastic. I think it is very challenging at the same time. I really enjoyed getting to talk about this story in relation to the idea of a flawed character. So in a sense, it's almost like a book review, but also I kind of use that as a jumping off point to talk about what makes us so engrossed in the tales of these flawed characters. And the setup for the story is that you follow this woman that I mentioned, and she is eventually going to become basically the head of a household for the women in the house, because of course the husband is the true head of the household. She is somebody that has a fairly good status though. When she is young, she is learning everything that she needs to learn to be a woman of high status, and that includes having her feet bound, that includes ensuring that she knows how to be very polite, how to carry herself, how to dress. And then she knows that her life is going to be broken up basically into 3 distinct sections. It is when she is living within her father's house, when she lives within her husband's house, and if her husband dies and is a widow, when she lives in her son's house. That is the extent of her entire world. That is all she will probably ever really know. So then finding agency within that, and especially, and this is where the main kind of plot of the story comes into the picture, is trying to maintain not only her own health, but the health of the women in her house. That side of the story is fascinating. So you see her grandparents really want to instill in her their knowledge of medicine, and she takes that to heart, and she then starts to try and ensure that she is paying close attention to servants, or she's paying close attention to potentially one day her husband's concubines, or the other women of the house, including her mother-in-law. All of these different women that are going to come in her orbit. She tries to do what she can to look after them and to also continuously expand her own knowledge of medicine. And as noted, she was a real person in history, and she is one of the only women from this time to have documented her findings, and that's still something that we look at. We still kind of go back to that and go, wow, this is incredible that she was able to discern all of this from this time. So you're kind of looking at what her life would have been like and how challenging it would have been to expand her knowledge in this area when this is not an area that it was expected or even approved of for women to look into. It's really, really well done. As stated, it's not the easiest of books to read because of some of the challenging material that's within it, but I thought it was exceptional and very important as well. The last thing I'll mention for today would be the Apothecary Diaries light novels. I'm not going to go as in-depth with these because this is something that I am going more in-depth with over on my side channel. So I have vlogs as I make my way through these light novels, and then also I am going to be doing in-depth discussions with my friends where we will be chatting spoilers for these. So if you're interested in hearing more about Apothecary Diaries, I'll have that linked. It is a read-along, so you are welcome to jump in and participate. But if you don't know anything about Apothecary Diaries, the origin of the story is a little convoluted. So the creator of the story originally wrote this kind of as a web novel, and then it was turned into light novels. I'll explain light novels here in a second. And then after being made into light novels, the light novels are now the source material for the anime adaptation. And then there are also 2 different manga adaptations for it. So there's a lot of different forms of Apothecary Diaries you can try to consume, but this is essentially the source material. It is translated as well, so that's something to take note of because sometimes certain things, maybe you might want to double check the translations online in case certain scenes play out in a way that is a little bit difficult to assess. But the way light novels are written is they do have usually they are not quite as long as a lot of books are. These are actually still longer than I think people realize. Like, some of them are over 300 pages. But a lot of times the way that the characters talk to each other is a little less formal, especially if, for example, in this story, it is historical fiction inspired. So we're not necessarily talking in the same way that you would expect people at that time to talk. And as such, it kind of creates this more casual feeling when you're dissecting the story as a whole. However, I think that this story actually does show, don't tell, better than most things I've ever encountered. And it's also really, really funny. It is written in a way where the way it's written, kind of similar to manga. Sometimes manga is written in parts and it's published in smaller chunks, and then they will collect those smaller chunks and that will be a volume. And light novels can sometimes be done the same way. And I do think that is why sometimes you will see a little bit of things repeated to you. So for example, if there's a character, it'll be like, oh, and this character was this person. And you're like, yeah, I just knew that a little bit ago. And aside from that, though, the light novel format, I think, has reshaped a little bit how I have come to think of how we can have stories delivered to us, because especially as fantasy fans, we typically have longer works, I would say. Even within series, the books within the series themselves tend to be on the longer side. Occasionally you'll have a novella, and that's very hit or miss for a lot of people, because a lot of people feel like a novella is not enough time for us to really get acclimated to the world, to get to know the characters, and we just feel like fantasy and novellas don't always go together. It can happen, of course. There are times where it can be done really well, but we typically expect for our books to be at least 300 pages or more. If it's under, we're like, whoa, this is short. We're really thrown off. And what I really like about the light novel format is there's a lot of volumes in this series, but none of the books are particularly long. And there's just something about how this is playing out where you kind of continuously come back to these characters, and you oftentimes just pick up right where you left off at the end of a light novel, that you end up reading a lot, but it doesn't feel like it. And I compared it in a reading sprint I did over on my side channel. I compared it to, if you've ever sat to watch something and you're trying to decide, do I want to watch a movie or do I want to watch a show? And the movie that you're thinking about watching, somebody's like, oh, it's 2.5 hours long, or it's almost 3 hours long, and you're like, whoa, that's so long, I don't want to watch that, that's too long. And then you'll start watching a TV show and you'll be like, next episode, next episode, next episode. And by the time you have finished watching however many episodes, you realize you actually watched more than you would have time-wise than if you had just sat and watched the movie. And that feeling of like, well, it's delivered in smaller amounts and I'm choosing to keep going, something about that I think feels very reminiscent to how the light novels are structured. So now I'm kind of like, I want more fantasy to be written like this, because I think that would work really well. It's a little bit of a side tangent. I just want to comment on the format a bit, because I think light novels, one, it's new to me, but I have a feeling it's probably new to a lot of other people as well. If you know nothing about Apothecary Diaries, the setup is that you follow the absolute most lovable protagonist named Mao Mao. And Mao Mao is somebody who's grown up in poverty. Her father has a lot of knowledge when it comes to being an apothecary and medicine and being a doctor, but he lives in poverty himself due to things in his past that you don't really know too much about. And Mao Mao kind of has her time split between being raised by him and helping him, and also being looked after in a lot of ways by these women from a place called the Verdigris House, which is essentially a brothel. So on the surface, Mao Mao's upbringing has seemed primarily centered in poverty, and also it's not the most glamorous of upbringings. And she ends up being kidnapped and sold into servitude into the rear palace, which is where the emperor and all of his consorts live. And there's a lot of intrigue, especially a lot of political intrigue, and also just kind of scheming that transpires within the rear palace. But also at times, there are people who try to poison the 4 most prestigious consorts. They are the ones that tend to have the most favor with the emperor. The more favor you have, the more likely you are to be the one that has the child who will go on to be the next emperor. And if that is the case, then wherever you are from or whoever's family you are associated with will likely be benefiting from the fact that the mother of the emperor, the future emperor, is the person who gains the most favor, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of court intrigue within the story, and Mao Mao is trying to keep her head down and stay out of it completely. She wants nothing to do with it because she recognizes, and the setting establishes this exceptionally, she knows if I'm out of line even a little bit, there is a power structure and people could very easily decide that they want to kill me, that they want to do something that would make my life worse. So she just kind of keeps her head down. She's going to try to work through her contract, and when her contract is done, she's just going to try to go back to her dad. And she cannot resist, though, because she essentially has an insatiable desire to learn. And she happens to be taking note of some of the rumors and things that are referencing the potential poisoning of some of the top concubines within the palace. And she kind of can't help but be intrigued. And this other individual who kind of oversees a lot of what transpires within the rear palace sees her being observant, and I think she knows more than she's letting on. So despite Mau Mau's desires to stay out of things, she kind of gets roped into it. And this is where you discover that Mau Mau is exceptionally brilliant. It's where everybody else recognizes that she's exceptionally brilliant, and also we can probably use this to our advantage. And so it kind of ends up having a 1, court intrigue story, 2, mystery of the week story, and then 3, there is a very, very, very slow romance within the story that a lot of fans are obsessed with. So if any of that sounds good to you, then I would recommend the anime. Certainly, I think the anime is great. I would very much recommend the sub. And yes, some of my friends make fun of me because I am a sub snob now, but truly the sub is significantly better for Apothecary Diaries. There are times where I actually don't think it makes that big of a difference, and in Apothecary Diaries, Mau Mau is borderline apathetic in how she presents herself. She seems disinterested in everything, if not somewhat even irritated in a lot of things. And for me, the voice actor for the sub brings that to life much, much better. I think there's almost a smugness within the dub. So I think that the sub is better in that sense. Also, I think some of the other characters, like the Emperor, for example, or Jinshi, who is the person that is taking note of Mau Mau being observant, I think those voice actors are a little bit stronger in representing the characters within the sub. So it's not just flippantly saying like, yeah, sub over dub. It's that I genuinely, knowing these characters really well, I think that the sub delivers on them a little bit better. But anyway, I do recommend the anime, and I recommend the light novels as well. They're a lot of fun. I think that they really show just how funny the writer actually is, because the way she describes things, or the way she has Mau Mau think of things, is really entertaining. It's great. It's so much fun. So I highly recommend those. I've currently finished the first 2. I'm about halfway through the 3rd. And we will be having a live show for the first 4, and that's what coordinates with the first 2 seasons that are out of the anime. And then after that, we'll be continuing into new terrain, new territory with the light novels, which I'm very much looking forward to. Really like Apothecary Diaries. If you've not checked it out, highly recommend. Please come join me and my friends in being obsessed, because it's great. Anyway, that's it for a recent wrap-up. As said at the beginning, I would love your feedback as to how you would like me to kind of go about talking about things that I haven't had a chance to talk about just yet that are separate from new fantasy releases, because I obviously love talking about books, so any opportunities to do so, I would love to do. And it kind of just feels like a return to classic booktube, how it used to be. People would do monthly wrap-ups and that sort of thing, and I think monthly wrap-ups can be tough because sometimes I'll read a lot and I really want to get more into the books, and so sometimes if there's a lot of books, it can just take forever. So I think I like the idea of doing like every 3 to 5 books I read. Let me know if you like that idea, or if you have any of your own suggestions, let me know. And then, as I asked at the beginning, what is a story or character you will hear nothing negative about? I want to know the answer to that too. Thanks so much though for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later.